Thank you all for joining us. My name is Erasma Veras Montecholo, and I am your host for Powering Up with Power of Two, in which we engage with community leaders, residents, and advocates to talk about the pressing issues affecting families and children in New York City, and the steps that we can each take as individuals and as a collective to ensure the health and well-being of our communities. A couple of reminders before we begin. We will make this video accessible in Spanish. We also encourage you to share your questions with us in the chat. So, today's conversation, I want to give you a bit of context before we start. As a community-born organization and one that I, a Brownsville-raised Afro-Latina, co-founded, we acknowledge the root cause of intergenerational trauma. We have seen that the issues of racial inequities and social injustices were not just outside our family door, but that they actually have permeated down to the very basic molecular level of the family unit. It's all the colonial constructs that have been working to shape a child's, a family's, and even a community's trajectory. It has shaped our most foundational relationships, that of a parent and a child. And how we nurture our children and how we discipline them have also been influenced by those colonial structures. Many of us listening today are familiar with the term, a child should be seen, not heard, or have been the recipients of a spanking, or as was, and continues to be commonly heard in my house growing up and in our community, a whooping or popping as a form of discipline when our caregivers felt that we stepped out of line or to prevent us from getting into trouble on the streets. However, decades of research shows that corporal punishment actually harms children and communities, including seeing that there are increased aggression and mental health problems caused by this form of disciplining. Our guest today, Dr. Stacey Patton, is the author of Spare the Kids, Why Whooping Won't Save Black America. It's a fantastic book that really examines the unique cultural and historical connection of corporal punishment in Black communities. Given the prevalence and acceptance of spanking in the United States, we believe that this conversation will be revelatory for many folks tuning in today. Dr. Stacey Patton is an adoptee, child abuse survivor, and former foster youth turned award-winning author, journalist, and advocate. Dr. Patton, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
Fantastic, thank you. So one of the things that we'd like to always do as part of, beginning our conversations is to ask our guests their personal connection to this work. So for those that are listening that are unfamiliar with your books and your research and your work more holistically, can you share what is your personal connection to this?
So as you mentioned in the bio, I am a child abuse survivor. I wake up every single day and look into the mirror and see old scars from that experience. I call it the fleshy braille that narrates the survival of, a young African-American girl who was adopted into a middle-class African-American family that believed this idea that children should be seen and not heard, speak when spoken to, and that their bodies should be processed through pain in order to teach them. And so as a kid, I was told that this was being done for my own good because it was a form of love and safety, that it was going to keep me from falling prey to all kinds of racial traps, including the criminal justice system, early pregnancy, and all of these other potentially bad outcomes. But when it was happening to me, it didn't feel like love. I felt like the only person who was going to seriously hurt me or maybe even kill me someday was my Black adoptive mother, who was rationalizing her abuse by drawing on racism and other excuses to legitimize her behavior. And so I ended up running away from home very early on in my childhood, spent pretty much most the rest of my childhood in the foster care system until going off to boarding school. And when that happened, I made this promise that I would spend the rest of my life trying to convince folks that children should not be hit under any circumstances, that it was damaging, to children psychologically, to their bodies, to their educational outcomes. And, it is a foundational moment when we end up perpetuating certain kinds of violences in adulthood. So it's basically my childhood experiences that inform this work and mission.
Thank you, Dr. Patton, for sharing that. What you're sharing resonates so deeply with me because I too was a child of trauma, and it took years of creating my own awareness, understanding where it came from, forgiving the people in my life who caused that harm, and understanding that they were perpetuating something that had been done to them, right? So they were repeating history, not understanding where that history is rooted in, right? Where that trauma is rooted in. And so I want us to spend some time traveling actually back in time, and really talk about that history. And so many of us are aware, thanks to work like yours and Dr. Joy DeGruy and others, that the history of hitting Black children not only has direct links to slavery, but actually goes back thousands of years in European history. Can you unpack that a little bit for our audience?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of times I hear people say that people have been hitting children for all of humanity, that this is a parenting practice that has always extended across cultures, across time and history and place. And that's not true. It is a byproduct of colonialism and slavery and indoctrination into a bastardized version or interpretation of Western Christianity. There's absolutely no evidence that this kind of ritualistic practice existed in West African cultures and many other indigenous cultures in North and South America. In fact, if you read the writings of early voyagers, European voyagers, anthropologists, ministers, and such missionaries, they were baffled by the ways in which indigenous people allowed their children to, quote, run wild, that they didn't beat them, that they didn't subject them to corporal punishment and the kinds of coercive practices that Europeans had been subjecting their own children to for millennia. And so when I talk with African Americans about the historical roots of this practice, I tell them that we don't begin on American plantations. We don't begin that story in West Africa. We go back a whole millennia. We go back to the medieval period in Europe, where Europeans were absolutely brutal and sadistic with their own kids. Now, that's not to say there weren't Europeans who loved and cared for and nourished their kids, but as a culture, children weren't even recognized as biologically distinct from adults. They were subjected to routine sexual abuse, infanticide. Their fairy tales and stories are rife. Some of the same popular fairy tales that we still read to kids are rife with violence against children. Childism was this a central component of the culture. My next book, I'm writing about child lynchings, and I was floored to walk away making the same statement that child lynchings did not begin in the post-Civil War South with African American children as victims. Europeans had been publicly hanging and burning their own kids. I've found evidence of mass hangings of children as young as age 6. And so these behaviors, these ideologies about children, these popular sayings that we channel as people of color, right, were exported from Europe to this particular dimension. The majority of enslaved people who ended up on those ships were young folks.
Mm-hmm.
These were people who hadn't even completed childhood yet, hadn't even raised kids. They didn't come here with a universal parenting guide that says, whoop your child, when they act out. These were mixed cultures, mixed language groups, had their different religious ideas and conceptions about children and child rearing. So the first place when we talk about decolonizing parenting is to ask, how did we get here?
Mm-hmm.
Where did these ideas come from? And were they always there? What did we do before this? And so there's not a whole, unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of written evidence about what was going on in a lot of pre-colonial cultures, because many of them were oral. But those oral narratives and testimonies that we do have are void of any of these traumatic stories about pick and switches and all that kind of stuff that people like to celebrate on social media. And it always baffles me that African Americans will say things like, they stole everything from us.
Mm-hmm.
They stole this cultural aspect, our naming practices, all these things, but whipping children was the one thing that survived the Middle Passage experience? I think not. So
Mm-hmm.
that's where we have to, dig through the history and demystify these popular myths and assumptions about what people have always done with children. And there's a great book by Peter Gray. It's called Free to Learn. And he gives a whole list of other indigenous cultures around the world where to this day, they still don't yell at children. They don't put their hands on them.
Right.
And so we
Right.
need to learn that history.
Yeah, no, exactly. I want to talk a little bit about that, because we talk with our families about returning to indigenous values, and we get a lot of, well, what do you mean? This is what my grandma did to me, and my mom did, and so this is part of our culture. And it's just like, well, actually, it is not, right? We go back to West Africa, as you were talking about. If we go back to indigenous communities here in the United States, we know that they centered children, right? And you talk about this, and I talk about this all the time with folks, but I want them to hear from you, like how were children centered in our communities, and why were they centered and so essential to families and communities?
Oh my
I'm
God,
getting all excited about this.
they were worshipped.
That's right.
They were considered gods. They were mystical. They were magical. They had special powers. They
Mm-hmm.
could make themselves fly and disappear, right? You look at the naming practices. So Babatunde, father has returned. Nigerians use, that
Mm-hmm.
term, or Yedatunde, mother has returned. The Bang people would never put a baby on the floor because that was disrespectful to a god, right? They weren't considered property or little
Mm-hmm.
demons or these beings that had devils inside of them that needed to be beaten out. There was none of that sort of fundamentalistic, toxic, nasty language used to describe children in our cultures. If you hit a child, that diminished you as an adult. There was this belief that you could, if you hit a child, that their spirit guides would depart from
Mm-hmm.
them, right? So, you have all of these sayings, like I can share with your audience. Like I have a whole list, I could email that to you. If you go across the continent, if you go across Africa, and you have these little sayings, don't give a child too much salt, right? So these wonderful metaphors about being gentle with children, and so it's that, just that language itself makes you feel good, like wow,
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
really revered, or children were considered returned ancestors, that they were these people who had already led deeply spiritual lives, that they chose their parents like they chose you. I refer to children as godlings, right? And some people wince when what? And I'll say, everybody say with me, your child is a god. And then the amount of pushback I get from people who cannot fix their lips to make such a beautiful statement about a
Yeah.
child, especially children of color who live in a world where everywhere they turn in this media ecosystem, they're being described as a problem,
Mm-hmm.
as a failure,
That's right.
and so as being dehumanized in some sort of way. So that's part of getting back to what you say, to that history, to our cultural values, is changing our language, purging our cultural lexicon of these toxic phrases, many of them rooted in biblical misinterpretation, getting back to how we used to talk about our kids.
That's right. Thank you for sharing that. It's interesting because I remember growing up, um, doing well in school, right? I was always, pretty engaged and pretty involved and always excelled. But my mom was hard pressed to give me a compliment, right? And I was just like, oh my gosh, how much can I possibly do to get that recognition from my mother? And by when reading your book and reading other research, I realized, oh my gosh, she was purposely doing that because she was so fearful that if I was too overly confident, the outside world was going to be cruel to me, was going to harm me, and so she felt that she needed to diminish my light in order to protect me. And it was hard to learn and appreciate that and forgive that. But I recognize, and we talk to our families about, we need to let go of that. We need to let go of those practices because we're causing so much harm, emotional, physical, intellectual harm to our children, and go back to celebrating them as individual, gifted, people, beings that have so much to contribute to our society and to our family and community.
See, I love what you're saying because we have to start looking at our children as corrective geniuses
Hmm.
to the hardships and losses and challenges and tragedies that our ancestors face.
Hmm.
That our kids are here because somebody had the audacity to survive the Middle Passage, had the audacity to survive some horrible thing on a plantation, some, some form of racial terrorism, right? So we have to look at our children with new eyes and understand their potential, right, to
Right.
subvert this system. And so when you talk to your child in this way, when you belittle them, when you diminish their light, you are becoming a co conspirator with this white
Mhm.
supremacist system that wants you to do that very thing. Because white supremacists have always understood the radical potential of healthy Black parenting, right? That Black parenting could be a site of resistance. Same thing for other indigenous folks, Black and brown and Asian folks in this country. Um, there's no vested interest in having parents of color instill self-esteem and self-worth and confidence in a healthy ego and to teach them to take up space in this world and to get the kind of socialization and education that could equip them to invert this whole nightmare and destroy it and create something new.
That's right.
Instead, they want us to parent from a place of fear, right? That
Yes.
fear, which forecloses all kinds of radical possibilities. I understand and I respect and I empathize with that fear, but we've got to move to a different space, right? To
Yeah.
see the potential that our children have to create something new.
Exactly. Exactly. So, many in our community speak about, the importance of disciplining our children in order to keep them safe, like just like, my mom did, and others do. But as a child advocate and historian, does whooping and spanking your children really support that theory that it keeps them safe or precludes them from engaging in risky behaviors?
Absolutely not. It
Hmm.
creates a kind of elusive parenting
Hmm.
that gives you the illusion that you have some sort of control over your child's destiny in this, dystopian hellscape that we live in, right? Slavery, for example, just gave enslaved parents the illusion of control, some aspect of control over their children's lives, but they were becoming co participants in producing good slaves,
Right.
right? And
Right.
today, flash forward, you have parents who are saying, oh, I whipped my child to keep them out of jail. Well, how's that working for us as a people, right? This is generally the first step, the very first step in facilitating the flow of Black and brown bodies to the carceral state, into the prison pipeline, right?
Can you speak a little bit about that? Like, what do you mean exactly? What do you mean the
So
first step?
we have tons of research,
Mhm.
more than a half a century's worth of research that shows what hitting a child, even when it doesn't leave a mark or a bruise or result in some other kind of injury, how it changes the brain, right? How it sows the seeds for aggressive behavior and deviance, how it forecloses the opportunity to learn. Part of being able to demonstrate that you learn is problem solving, critical thinking, communication, emotional regulation. So when you start hitting your child, people start popping their kids when they're infants, before they're even verbal, right? And so you're sowing the seeds for all of these molecular changes in the brain and in their thinking. And so you're teaching your child, you're literally wiring your child to learn to avoid pain, right? And to comply only when there's a threat. And then with that aggression and rage, they turn it elsewhere. They take it out of your house, into the schools, into the streets. You've got these big people in your life who are supposed to love and nurture you, who teach you that might is right, that this is how you get respect. This is how you get people to do what you want them to do, is through violence.
Mm.
And so you have these kids who are going into racist school systems, which are the classrooms are being led mostly predominantly by white women who are outside of our culture, who have an attributional bias when they encounter children of color, um, particularly males, and disproportionately they respond to these children's behaviors, their trauma responses, through harsh punitive practices, suspensions, expulsions, and such. And so all of this started though before these children even entered kindergarten. I call it the parent to prison pipeline. People find
Mm.
that term offensive, but that's where it starts. And you're setting them up, you're priming them, you're making them vulnerable to these traps that are already waiting for our children.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me ask you, this question um, about, some parents say to us that and generally I think people argue that there's a difference between spanking a child and abuse, right? So caregivers say that, whenever they pop or they whoop, they also explain to the child that they're being disciplined for, poor and bad behavior, and that they're doing it, as we talked about before, out of love. But can children really make the distinction between, all of these different mixed messages that are coming to them?
The only kind of relationship where people think it's okay to say, I hit you because I love you, or let me sit down and talk to you and tell you why I'm about to hurt your body,
Mm-hmm.
is with children. And what happens is that's a form of trauma bonding. And so you're training your child's brain very early on, as that prefrontal cortex area of the brain is developing, to fuse the messages of pain and love together and violence so that it becomes a biological experience. And then we wonder why young people grow up to get into relationships that are toxic and violent, or they become perpetrators, right? So you're sending just horrible mixed messages to a child very early on. People often tell me there's a difference between spanking a child and abusing a child. That's not true. It's simply not true. A child's brain cannot distinguish between a regular spanking that doesn't leave any sort of visible signs of, injury, severe abuse, which does, and sexual abuse. That's not how the brain works. The brain only recognizes stress chemicals. All three
Mm-hmm.
events are toxic stress events that trigger the exact same neurochemical responses in the child's body, which a parent can't see underneath the flesh of your child. So you don't necessarily pay attention to the pupils dilating. You can't see that heart racing under the chest. You can't see the lungs hyperventilating. You don't see cortisol bursting off of those adrenal glands sitting on the tops of the kidneys and coursing, flooding through the child's body. You don't see what's happening in their gut, in their intestines, in their bladder, how the reproductive organs are also responding to this. Hitting a child is a multi organ and system process. It doesn't just affect the area of the body where you hit the child. And over time, this causes toxic stress, which wears on the child's immune system, literally changes the physical architecture of the brain, lays the foundation for all kinds of chronic health problems that might not show up until after puberty or later in life when you're sitting there and you're morbidly obese, or you got high blood pressure, or you got heart problems. That stroke is part of this a lot of static load, this accumulation of toxic stress that the body keeps to score
That's right.
when you're hitting a child. So, there is no difference between spanking a child and abusing a child. What people think about is legal terms for abuse and what
Mhm.
you can see on top of the flesh with the eyes. But inside the child's body, whether it's sexual abuse, a spanking, or physical abuse, the body tells the exact same story.
You shared, Dr. Patton, an anecdote, earlier today before we went live that I was hoping you can share with our audience today about, the as you were talking about, how the entire body, the system reacts, but that it also has a particular impact on our genitals, right? On a child's genitals. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So I was in a church, a few hundred people, and doing a community conversation. The audience was largely African American. And there was a mama in the audience who raised her hand and she disagreed with my statement that there's no difference between spanking a child and abusing a child. And she's like, hitting a child on the butt is not abuse. This is what I do with my son, and that is not abuse. So I asked her to come up, you know, near the pulpit because it was in the church. And I had the big screen up, and I pulled up a anatomical view of the backside of the body, and I said to her, "Mama, what's underneath this?" And she looked at it. She said, "It's the ass. What do you mean?" And so everyone starts laughing. I'm like, "Yeah, you're right, but what's
Mhm.
underneath it?" And she looked again, and she couldn't answer the question. So I turned to the audience. I said, "Anybody, somebody in here, can someone tell me what's underneath this?" And everyone just kind of looked at me. I said, "So basically, y'all think, the buttocks, just this cushy area, perfect for whipping kids. Y'all believe that God actually made, there are people who actually say this is why God made the buttocks, perfect place to hit kids, right? It is an
Yeah,
erotogenic zone, right? It's an erogenous zone, right? It's part of, that as a pleasure point.
that's right.
And so I changed the screen and I brought up another anatomical view, this time with the skin dissected back. And I said, what have we got here, mama? A whole network of nerves, blood vessels connected to the spine, connected to the brain, all this, right?
Mhm.
And this is one particular vessel, blood vessel, that branches off to the genitals. So when you hit your son, and there's that instant blood flow. Some of that that blood is branching off into the genitals. The only other time we see that kind of genital blood flow is during sexual arousal. And there was a collective gasp in the sanctuary. And the mother took offense. She was like, "You nasty. I'm not trying to like get my son aroused when I'm whipping him." And I told her, I said, "I understand that that's not your intent. Nobody's intending to do that, but this is how the body works."
That's right.
And people don't understand basic biology. They don't understand how the brain works, the heart, all of these connections, and how pain and pleasure are weirdly intertwined sometimes in these moments. And so you have some people who grow up, and part of this pain becomes grafted into their sexual experiences. And also, when you hit your child, it is a violation of the body. When I was writing Spare the Kids, I interviewed um, grown men who told horrible stories about their moms hitting them in their genitals, when they were being beaten with belts, switches, etc. We remember the case of Adrian Peterson,
That's
who
right.
lacerated his son's genitals with a switch. I talked to so many women who had experienced corporal punishment and sexual abuse. And when I asked over and over again, why didn't you disclose that you were being sexually abused by whomever it was? And repeatedly, I kept hearing things like, I would get a whipping, or at least it wasn't a whooping when I was being. So they had to choose which pain was worse. Because when you're telling a child, I whip you because I love you, and you got some creepy predator in the family or elsewhere who says, oh, I'm doing this because you're special, because I love you. How's the child supposed to determine which one is right or not? Or girls, women who told me that they were caught masturbating by their moms and received a whooping for it. So there's, so you're priming your children to be victims and potentially predators when you violate their bodies in this way.
I've been curious about this. Do you see a distinction among socioeconomic class in terms of, the abuse, not abuse, but the spanking that's perpetuated in communities? Do you see a difference?
We know based on the data that the majority of Americans are still hitting their kids. There's been a gradual decline since, the mid 20th century when they started, keeping data on this. So like Child Trends has been steadily keeping up with attitudes. And parents lie too. They, in these surveys as well. But the data still tells us that the majority of American kids are still being hit. Now, there's this idea that African Americans are statistically higher on that chart, but it's not true. What we see, with the exception of Asians, is that every race and ethnic group in this country, among each of those groups, the majority of the parents in every single one of those groups hit their kids. Now, in terms of socioeconomics, people think that it is majority poor single moms who beat their kids. We know that in terms of the abuse rates, that there's some truth to this statement, particularly within African American communities. The majority of children are abused and even killed by their mothers, age 40 and under. I've seen less micro data to tell us whether those are middle class moms, poor, or wealthy. But we know that hitting children extends across socioeconomic groups. In terms of abuse, the reason why we have more data which shows that it's poorer people abusing their kids is because their communities are under hyper surveillance from law enforcement and from social services. And these parents have to navigate systems, social systems, social services systems, where they're subjected to more scrutiny. But middle class and wealthy people, they beat their kids and they even abuse their kids, but they have certain privileges and resources to help them skirt detection.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. I've been really interested in hearing from you directly. There are some folks out there that are critics of your work, right? Because they say that your work in and of itself is a harsh critique of Black caregivers. I don't see it to be that at all. But I want to hear from you. What is your response to that critique about your work? That it's a harsh criticism of Black caregivers.
It depends on my mood, the day it's being said and how it's being said to me. I mean, people have told me, or said, Stacey Patton hates Black mothers. I've heard it a little bit about fathers, but mostly about Black mothers, because much of my focus has been on maternal violence because that's what the data shows us. A lot of the critics and people who loudly, advocate beating kids, I hear are women.
Yeah.
When I look at these viral videos, it's majority women beating these kids, and publicly shaming them. And so it's a hard truth that people don't like to swallow. And I don't do this because I hate mothers. It's the exact opposite. I recognize our power and our potential to raise up a new generation of empowered young people who can fight this system. They can't do this and they're broken down, low self-esteem, scared, hypervigilant, and suffering from trauma, and don't have a healthy sense of themselves. Sometimes I ignore it. I understand that it's a defensive reaction because they need to defend themselves or their own mama. It's like nobody wants to look back on their parents and say, oh my God, that really hurt. That messed me up in some sort of. You can still honor your mother and father and still say that was wrong.
That's right.
So I've gotten to a point where I'm pretty much immune to it, and it becomes yet another one of those reflexive, defensive statements like spare the rod, spoil the child, which isn't even in the Bible. People who don't even go to church like to quote that scripture to legitimize beating kids. So I used to be hurt by the statement, and I would say, y'all, you've got it all wrong. I used to try to defend myself. And so I'm just at a point where I'm not here for adult fragility. I think about, the thousands of children who've died and who die every single year in African-American communities. An average of 400 children every single year are killed as a result of maltreatment. So I'm not here for the adult fertility. I'm here to center these children and their lives.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, it's part of healing, right? Is to recognize the harm that was done to you, committing not to, perpetuate it with your own children. And also try, if possible, to forgive those that cause you the harm, right? So if your parent caused you the harm, have those conversations because it's part of the healing process for yourself and for your family. But also helping to recognize that we as caregivers have the opportunity to parent differently, right? We take the good from how we were parented, but we also have the opportunity to just put in a little box all of that negative stuff that happened to us and really shape and reimagine how we parent in a way that's healthy and liberating. And you're right that liberates our children into recognizing their own value as people and building their confidence so that they can push back on the system that has been oppressing us. That is so important, and that's part of the work that we do. I have some questions here that are coming in from parents, so let me pull those up and share those with you because you and I can talk about this stuff for hours. For hours, that. So here's one from Olivia. My granny would spank me when I gave her attitude, and I learned to respect her. Why isn't it okay to do that with my 9-year-old daughter who is sassy and talking back to me? I feel like it's my duty to spank her so that she understands the importance of respect.
So a lot of people conflate respect with ego. Is your ego that fragile that you have to put hands on a child? A lot of people don't understand brain development and, developmental milestones, communicate, how children actually communicate, how children are sort of asserting themselves, their identity, their place in the world, testing boundaries and such. And so they interpret that behavior as bad, as disrespectful, as sassy. And again, a lot of this is deeply rooted in colonial ideas about children. So, like when I was a kid, rolling your eyes, sucking your teeth,
Mm.
all that was seen as, oh, you got a whooping for that kind of stuff. But where does that come from? So I can't think of the title of the book right now, but I've referenced it in some of my other work, which goes back to the plantation, where you had these Africans who part of their communication patterns, this is very normal, rolling the eyes, sucking teeth. Like if you ever watched like a Nigerian film, or
Mm-hmm.
all you hear is people sucking their teeth, and
That's right.
that was just normal. That's what
It's
we did,
culture. It's,
right? It's
yeah, yeah.
culture.
That's right.
Or like twerking has been part of the diaspora for millennia, but people are whipping their daughters for twerking, and so in the plantation context, massa taught us that looking them straight in the eyes, rolling their eyes, sucking their teeth, doing these things that we've been doing since before they devolved out of Africa and became colonizers.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's like disrespectful behavior. And here we are, centuries later, beating our kids for it and calling it good parenting and putting a child in their place rather than seeing them as, individual human beings, who are expressing themselves. As adults, we do it all the time. We roll our eyes, we suck our teeth. This is what we do, right?
That's right.
But when children do it, we just think of it as, something that needs to be beaten out of them.
That's right. And you raise that raises a question for me. So UNICEF's Convention on the Rights of the Child states that children and young people have the same general human rights as adults, and also specific rights that recognize their special needs. And so children are neither the property of their parents, nor are they helpless objects of charity. They are human beings and are the subject of their own rights. And so I'm sharing that because what you're saying is so in line with that, right? That children have a right to their own bodies, their own physical bodies. But how do you communicate that to a parent?
It's hard because what people don't understand is this term childism. Like we know what racism is, we know what sexism is, we know about all these other phobias, transphobia, homophobia, of these other things and what they look like. But as a culture, and I should add that the United States has not signed on to that
Mm-hmm.
Convention of the Rights of the
No.
Child, even though we're a country that likes to, cast itself as some kind of democratic model for how you should, treat children. But we don't do enough to educate folks on childism. I'm pulling something up off of, hopefully I can find it really quickly here for you to give people a sense of um, what childism is. I'm going to, and I shared this meme with folks all the time to break it down so that um, they can really understand. Here we go. What I mean by this, it's called the anti-childism scale, right? So childism is prejudice. So these everyday prejudices and microaggressions against children in terms of how we talk to them, how we treat them. Children are the only group of human beings that don't have the right to consent, meaning
Mm-hmm.
like you and I can say, don't touch me, don't hit me. But with children, we can't do that. They can't do that. So they have these 6 categories of on this anti-childism scale. And so as parents hear this, they can sort of think about where they are on this scale. Now you want to get to number 6 on the scale. I like to think of myself as on number 6 on the scale. But number 1 is the dominator, right? So these are people who believe children must be controlled by adults and must be respectful of adult authority. And these are the kind of people that only grant minimal rights to kids. That's the dominator. So where are you? Are you a dominator? Number two, the inquirer. So these are people who question the power dynamics between children and adults, and they're open to some discussion, but they continue to behave like a dominator. Then you have the third one, which is the convert, right? So these are the people who accept that children face discrimination at the hands of adults, but may be uncomfortable taking action beyond discussion. So these are the kind of folks who might be sitting at the table when people are talking about beating kids, and you're like, I don't necessarily agree, but they won't speak up. They won't say anything. They become complicit. Their silence becomes complicity, right? Then number four, you got the critic. So these are the kind of people who regard children as deserving of protection from discrimination. They express beliefs only when it's safe, but may not speak out when the cost is too high to children's lives, right? Then you got number five, right? So we're moving up. We're getting better here. The embracer. These are the people that recognize children as equals in humanity, equal to adults, right? And chooses inclusion of children whenever possible, even in the face of open criticism. But they still retain some unexamined childism. So these are the kind of people who will say things like, you're being, say to another adult, you're being childish. So their language still hasn't evolved because you're still talking about the nature of children as a kind of slur, like a sort of inferior thing. And then the last one is where I like to be, and I consider you to be there too, is the subverter. We are subverters. We elevate children in word and deed. We believe children deserve equal rights as adults. We understand that children have varying capacities to manage freedoms. We meet children where they are, and we encourage others to do the same. And we seek out and actively resolve any internalized childism that we might still be holding in our bodies and unconsciously or subconsciously perpetuating. So the first is to define for these parents what childism is, what it looks like, what it sounds like, what are the policies and the practices and the beliefs, and where are they on that scale, and to try to move them and their behaviors. It's about undoing a lot of, our own socialization, which may have been 30, 40 years of this. It doesn't change overnight.
That's right. So that was going to be my next question. And I have to get to some questions from the audience, but, can we do this? How many generations do you think it's going to take for us to get, I know it's a tough question. How many generations do you think it's going to take for us to get there, to get to that place when we're all sixes?
So you're talking about, you have to look at childism in its current iteration as a continuation of a long history. Remember earlier I was talking about corporal punishment, and child hangings, right? All of this stuff, nursery rhymes, Christianity, all that kind of stuff. All of this is a continuation of a long history of anti-child violence, right? So we've inherited that. You talked about it, how it's in our genes. It's operating in us at the molecular level, right? When I was a kid growing up in the 80s and 90s, people were talking about domestic violence, but there was very, very rarely any conversation about hitting kids as a form of domestic violence or abuse. We are just starting to have those conversations. We are in our infancy, pun intended, when it comes to this movement. I think about in the early 20th century, wives were still being beaten, right? It was legal to do this. And so what we're doing right now is sowing the seeds for this. And with each generation, my hope is that, within the next 100 years, people are looking back and they're like, oh my God, folks used to hit children? How barbaric, how backwards, what kind of colonizer mess was that? We want them to frown on it the same way we do this idea of, intimate partner violence. So you're talking about undoing centuries worth of logic and cultural thinking and myths and behaviors and healing bodies. Because we also know, if you know anything about epigenetics, that we pass on that trauma
we sure
for
do.
generation in our bodies.
That's right.
So it's going to take it's going to take a long time.
So
you and I won't see it.
No, no, I'm trying. I'm trying with mine, and I'm trying, to support our communities in doing that healing work too. Um, but I think, but it's not just us, right? So it's not just our own families and our own communities, but the system itself has to commit to that, right? And so I am hopeful that, through this administration, we're going to make some headways. But you're right, it's gonna take hundreds of years. Okay, some questions from our audience. Let's see, we have a question from Yolanda here. How do you recover from telling your story in order to help educate us? So how did you recover from by telling your story to help
Oh,
educate
okay.
us?
So I think Yolanda's question is about healing. It was the telling of the story and telling the truth about the story, right? And centering the child and not committing treason against the child by making everybody else comfortable with my truth. That was essential core part of my healing. And and knowing that people are listening. And when I have parents who write to me and say, I'm committing not to do this to my child again. Like I literally sit at my computer, which is like this ugly cry when I see those messages. And I feel it in my body. And it makes me happy to know that at least one kid is not going to walk around with these scars on their face, and experience that pain. So it's that sharing, it's that educating, and it's not easy to do. I take a lot of flack and hate because I love other people's kids. That's the weirdest. It's just the weirdest thing to me. Like I don't understand it. But the work that I do is ancestral. I do it for the ancestors because I believe if I come back in this lifetime again, nobody's, my next lifetime, I'm going to be reincarnated as a kid and nobody is going to put their hands on me because I feel like I'm fulfilling some kind of karmic agreement.
I love that. Thank you. Let's see. Another question here is, how do we have effective conversations? This is from Logan. How do we have effective conversations with friends and family about corporal punishment? It can be a sensitive topic that can lead to lots of tension.
I find that some of the most effective ways to do this is to have people go back in their own memories, in their own experiences, return to their child bodies and ask them, what do you remember about being hit? How did your body feel? Right? And sometimes you'll literally see them sit back and pause and go and you trace their eyes. I teach visual communication, so reading body language, and you see them reaching for those memories and trying to connect with their bodies, because so many times when we have the conversations, it's these ideological debates, right? Everybody feels like they have to defend something. They have to defend their parents. They have to defend their religion. They have to defend their communities. They have to defend their image. They have to let people know that I'm not in jail and I'm a successful person because I was beaten. I'm not traumatized. I don't have mental health issues. All that's where the conversations generally start. But nobody says, go back to when you were 4, 5 years old, the first time you got hit. What did that feel like? Let's talk about that. And usually there's this stillness and silence, sometimes tears. Some people get defensive. They don't want to go back there because it hurts too much, right? And so we get people to honestly, in a very safe setting, to tell the truth about how it felt and what they thought about it, right? And how do you think you needed to be hit? Was there another way that somebody could have maybe, gotten the message or to you or taught you how to do X, Y, and Z, right? Do you really believe you needed that, right? So we have conversations like that. But I also find that I'm most successful with parents when I talk about the science of corporal punishment. So many times we believe that Black and brown folks are so wedded, so married to these cultural myths about beating kids that they don't have the intellectual capacity to process science.
But they do.
They absolutely do. I've done it in
Yep.
Pentecostal churches. talk about epigenetics and the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex and all of those terms, but in ways that they understand it. I don't talk at them. I don't talk at them with judgment, but I say, look, I love your kids. I have a vested interest in seeing us as a people heal and thrive. So I just want to share this information. Did you know that when you hit a child, this happens inside the body? Mm-hmm. Did you know that, and you give them the data, you give them, even this idea that beating your kids will keep them from being killed by the cops. You respond to that with data. Right. You say, okay, between 2013 and 2018, a total of 42, I think it's 42, Black children were killed by cops. During that same exact time period, over 4,000 Black children were killed by their own parents. You show them the data, right? You show them the facts, and people are going to do what they do. Yeah, it's going to be always going to be a hard conversation. People are going to get mad at you. They're going to curse you out and call you names, but the seed has been planted, and they're going to continue thinking about it. And you just never know. You might shift them.
That's right. That's right. And that's exactly what we do. We talk about not just the importance of this foundational relationship between the caregiver and the child, but we connect it to the science. And we're seeing in our work that connection is really changing behavior.
Yep.
In such a healthy and positive way. And so I wholeheartedly agree with what you're saying. I know we have 4 minutes. So in 4 minutes, Dr. Patton, I would like us to conclude the conversation with some final thoughts from you or a call to action that you would like to share with our audience.
I think you should read Spare the Kids, Why Whooping Children Won't Save Black America.
Snaps to that. We're going to make it available, folks, to you.
You can go to my website, sparethekids.com. There's all kinds of tips and techniques that you can try, alternatives to hitting kids. The site is going to be undergoing a huge overhaul in the coming year. I think that those of you who are child advocates, who are not African American, who are in other communities, somebody needs to write a version of Spare the Kids for those specific cultures, to unpack the ways in which colonialism undergirds and has distorted the natural ways that you interact with your children, and how racism and xenophobia and hostility toward immigrants and such also bleeds into the ways in which you socialize their children. So that's my call to action for more research, more historically based research, so that these communities can understand how those historical echoes are still poisoning our relationships. I encourage people to understand the science. I have lots of resources, so you can reach out to me. I can give you books. I can give you slides that I've put together that I share with communities when I do these conversations, videos and such, and become conversant in it. When you see a child being hit, speak up the same way you would speak up if you see an adult being assaulted, right? That's part of that anti-childism scale. So every time you see somebody hitting a kid, talking horribly to them, and you don't speak up, that's like number 2 on the scale, right? Your silence is complicity. Those of you who want to make the change and stop hitting your kid, right? Most of the problem is in you. People don't like to hear that, but if you're hitting your child, it's because you've got some emotional regulation issues, that you've got some childism going on, some internalized racism that's informing your beliefs about your kids needing to be processed through violence. So I suggest you get some therapy, some anger management, as well, to deal with why you're putting your hands on a child that cannot, defend themselves. So those are sort of my just off the top of my head, suggestions. There are great books out there that I can share with you if you write to me to help you understand child development, how the child's brain works and develops. Because a lot of times y'all are beating kids for things that are absolutely normal. Right?
Developmentally appropriate. Yeah.
Yes. And your
Exactly.
children are not bad. So please purge your lexicon of that term. Remember that your children are gods. They are
That's right.
absolutely gods. They are gifts from the ancestors. They are corrective genius to this nightmare of colonialism and slavery and Jim Crow terrorism and state-sanctioned violence. Every time you hit your child, Massa thanks you for upholding his legacy.
Dr. Patton, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your personal story and insights and how we can restore African and Indigenous child rearing by healing and recentering our children. Thank you all for tuning in today. And to those of you that are watching and listening, I will leave you this from W.E. Du Bois, one of the NAACP's founders. He said that that children face a sneering and cruel world. So he recommended in his book that he wrote in 1926 that books and pictures and music and cleanliness and order and sympathy and understanding, information, friendship, and above all, love. There is not much evil in the world that can stand against such home surroundings. So fill your home with love and sympathy and empathy for your children. Stay well and healthy, everyone. Take care.